Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here with you today. Thank you, Amanda, for the introductions. As Amanda said, my name is Tamara Tamimi. I am from Jerusalem, Palestine, and today I come to you wearing a traditional Palestinian dress that signifies the unity of Palestine. It's over 80 years old, used to belong to my grandmother, and represents Palestine united and unfragmented in bringing patterns from Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Bir al-Saba, as well as other places. Today I'll be speaking to you about the genocide that is unfolding and ongoing in Gaza, a devastating situation, a devastating event that we are speaking about. But it is an important topic to be speaking about and addressing. Here, I start by speaking about what is a genocide, how we can show the intent of Israeli political and military officials. Then I connect that to the actual acts and measures perpetrated by Israel during the past 8 months. Then I place that within the wider historical and political framework of Palestine. And ultimately, I don't want to end on a depressing note, so we finish by thinking together about what is it that we can do to counter the ongoing events. So, to start with, what is a genocide here? And to define genocide, I draw on the Genocide Convention, or its complete name, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, here, which identifies two key elements to genocide. The first one being a material element, and the second one is an element of intent. So for the material element, we're talking about killing members of the group. We're talking about inflicting serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. We're talking about deliberately inflicting on the group's conditions of life that are intended to destroy the group. Number 4 of the measures is imposing measures intended to prevent births in the group. And number 5 is transferring the children of the group to another group. Now, all of these individually, they amount to war crimes, crimes against humanity, or both. But when they are undertaken with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, then that's what amounts to genocide. And so from this, we note that genocide, what sets it apart from other international crimes is the intent to destroy in whole or in part here. And usually that's the hardest part to prove in any genocide tribunal or trial that is happening, because it's very difficult to show that this is the actual intent of the perpetrators, whether they are the military commanders or the political leadership here. But never has it been as easy as it is now in this situation to see the actual intent of Israeli officials. For example, we have seen Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on October 9th saying that they will cut off electricity, water, fuel, food, and everything, referring to Palestinians as human animals, in a clear sign of the dehumanization of Palestinians. Similarly, the Israeli President, Isaac Herzog, who is considered to be a moderate, not a radical, he said there are no innocents in Gaza. And we see here in the other picture him signing a missile that will be dropped shortly after that on Gaza. Also, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu invoked the biblical story of Amalek, which commanded Israelites to destroy everyone in Amalek, not just men, women, children, the elderly, trees, infants, cattle, sheep, camels, and donkeys here. And this is not the first time that the Israeli establishment invokes Amalek. Israeli settlers in the West Bank, including Jerusalem, they continuously invoke Amalek to justify the murder of Palestinians. Agricultural Minister Avi Dichter referred very clearly to what they are doing is a second Nakba, Nakba 2023. For those who do not know what the Nakba is, the Nakba refers to the events between late 1947 and early 1949, when at least half of the Palestinian indigenous population was ethnically cleansed and expelled from the land of historical Palestine in order to create the State of Israel. And lastly, if you're wondering that these statements only happened at the beginning of the genocide and not towards the end, I refer you to National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, the far-right minister, who on June 4th was calling for the cutting of humanitarian aid to see what will that do to Palestinians. So are these just mere statements and rhetoric, or are they tied to actual action here? And we see that it is tied to very clear actual action. I plan to go through this individually in 6 main areas. I'll do that briefly because I do want to get to putting this within the wider political framework, but happy to discuss any of this further in the Q&A. So at the first level, in category 1, when we're talking about the scale of killing and maiming, up until June 14th, on day 253, there were at least 30,266 Palestinians killed. During the 70% of them are women, are children. During the same period, more than 85,000 Palestinians have been injured in Palestine. We also need to note that there are over 10,000 Palestinians trapped under the rubble in a report issued by the United Nations in May, noting that it will take up to 3 years to excavate the bodies and retrieve the bodies because of the primitive tools that are available, the lack of bulldozers, the lack of excavators, and the lack of sufficient personnel. When we look at these figures, these represent almost 6% of the Palestinian population in Gaza here. If we're going to look at this in comparative terms, we're looking at 19.3 million in the USA, almost 4 million in the UK, and almost 5 million casualties in Germany. Here. They're not figures that are very dissimilar to World War II, noting that this has been going on for less than a year instead of 6 years in World War II. In terms of the trajectory of displacement, we now have 1.7 million Palestinians internally displaced. They represent 75% of the population here. At its peak, 85% of the Palestinian population was internally displaced. This figure represents the same population of Northern Ireland in here. The trajectory of displacement can be very easily seen through this map, where Palestinians were continuously pushed from the north of Wadi Gaza, this artificial border here, to the south of Wadi Gaza, through multiple waves of displacement in here. They were prevented from returning through the erection of 2 checkpoints on the 2 main roads, with the army stationed and covering that area. There was a shoot-to-kill policy for anyone who would return back from north of Wadi Gaza. At a certain point here in Rafah, in this tiny stretch of land, we had over 2 million or almost 2 million Palestinians, noting that the normal residency in this area does not reach 300,000. Since the assault on Rafah, almost 1 million of those who were internally displaced in Rafah, they were further internally displaced, but more up north, back to Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah. Many Palestinians, the vast majority of the Palestinians, have been subjected to multiple waves of displacement. But this trajectory of displacement, of pushing Palestinians south, it is not dissimilar to the one that is very well documented in 1948, and particularly in the case of Haifa, where Palestinians were continuously pushed further into the sea until they didn't have any choice but leave, demonstrating the ethnic cleansing intentions of the Israeli establishment, settler colonial establishment. Now, Now, the idea is also that a key part of the genocide that is ongoing in Gaza is rendering Gaza uninhabitable, and we can demonstrate this through multiple indicators. So, for example, at the level of the scale of destruction, just a few key indicators on this: 60% of residential buildings are destroyed, 80% of commercial buildings are destroyed. These figures are from January, so they likely have increased by now. It will take 14 years to clear the rubble and unexploded ordnance, because the rubble in Gaza is 300 times, 30 times the size of the Gaza Strip. It will require reconstruction at least 25 billion US dollars. This is the level of destruction that we are seeing in Gaza at the moment. Another key issue here of rendering Gaza uninhabitable, and I decided is starvation and food insecurity. I decided to spare you the images of starving children and of destroyed homes and destroyed personal belongings, such as living rooms and libraries and all of that. I'm sure you can imagine it yourselves here. But when it comes to food insecurity, I referred previously to the 2 checkpoints that were stationed that prevented people from returning. But these 2 checkpoints are also the checkpoints that controlled entry of goods across the Gaza Strip. So we have the coastal road checkpoint here and the Salah ad-Din checkpoint here. These are named after the 2 main roads in the Gaza Strip. Essentially what happened since the ground invasion into Gaza, things have been prevented from reaching north of Wadi Gaza, so availability of the very basic goods is not available here. In the south, because humanitarian aid has been severely restricted, standing at the entry of an average of 9 truckloads a day in October, and rising to a maximum, the highest number in April, to 169 truckloads a day, the very basic food products are very scarcely available. This is, of course, compared to 500 truckloads a day before the assault started on October 7th in Gaza, and when food insecurity was standing at 70%. Of course, this limited availability has led to a massive increase in the cost of the very basic products, including flour, rice, sugar, salt, milk, tomatoes, and cucumbers, just to name a few. What has this led to? It has led to 50% of the population now in Gaza being at the highest level of food insecurity, starvation level, according to the IPC classification. 40% at level 4, which is considered to be emergency, and 10% at level 3, which is considered to be crisis level. The indicators and the implications of this are astounding. Essentially, 96% of women and children aged below 2 years of age are not meeting their nutrient requirements. They need supplements in order to be able to survive, essentially. More than 50,000 children need treatment for acute malnutrition here. We have, and all of this has culminated with, up until June 15th, 3 days ago, with the dying of 33 Palestinians north of Wadi Gaza. This is a picture to put in a good positive note. This is a picture of a cucumber that was smuggled south of Wadi Gaza to north of Wadi Gaza through 7 different carriers, essentially, and that was shared by 11 Palestinians during Ramadan in March, shared by 11 very happily, because they haven't eaten anything for 3 days by then. Similarly, we see that to render Gaza uninhabitable in the long run, previously there was the destruction of cropland. 43% of the cropland in Gaza is destroyed. These figures are from February this year. They do not account for the assault on Khan Yunis and Rafah. in terms of the destruction of the educational system, we do not have any schools in Gaza. We do not have any universities in Gaza. All school children are deprived from education. The damage to the schools is astounding, basically. This is intended to instill or push for the voluntary migration of Palestinians from Gaza. Similarly, with the healthcare system, there are 36 hospitals in Gaza. 19 of them are now out of service. The others are partially functioning depending on availability of fuel, of equipment, and all of that. It's important to note, you see here in the picture the destruction of Al-Shifa Hospital complex. While it is one hospital, it accounts for 30% of the medical capacity in Gaza. What this renders is that Israel has destroyed the systems to count the number of the actual casualties. Secondly, it has rendered the health infrastructure unable to treat chronic diseases like diabetes, dialysis, and cancer, thereby increasing the number of indirect casualties. Thirdly, anything that is not a trauma case is not a priority to treat, including communicable diseases, thereby also increasing the indirect casualties on this. Now, a second key issue of proving genocide, essentially, is that you need to show that these are consistent actions over a prolonged period of time. And many people are saying that this hasn't been going on for long enough to show that, to tie the intent to actual action in here. But, well, I have news for you. This did not start on October 7th or October 8th. It's been going on for 76 years. We see that there are three major Palestinian milestones of mass exodus: the 1948 Nakba, the 1967 Nakba, and now. But during these periods, between these major milestones, these have not been periods of calm. These have been periods marred with Israeli settler colonialism that is very intrinsically linked to the logic of elimination of Palestinians in here. So, in 1948, the Nakba, half of the Palestinian indigenous population is displaced, 531 villages are destroyed, 11 urban centers are depopulated. In a nutshell, this is what we call the Palestinian catastrophe. In 1967, Israel seizes an additional 90,000 square kilometers of land. It occupies the remainder of the land of historical Palestine, parts of Egypt and parts of Syria, annex Jerusalem, and further displace another 300,000 Palestinians. Between these two milestones, the military rule years inside the Green Line in present-day Israel, Israel used a combination of Ottoman and British laws to expropriate Palestinian property, prevent the refugees from returning. This also includes Israeli laws, basically, but also expropriate Palestinian land completely. And through another set of laws, subjugate Palestinians into second-class citizens in their own homeland through bans on movement, political organization, and work opportunities. Since 1967, in the periods of calm that the peace process has provided cover for, since then, we stand today to be witness to 151 Israeli settlements in the West Bank, including Jerusalem, over 100 Israeli outposts, more than 720,000 settlers in the West Bank, including Jerusalem, and a myriad of methods to displace Palestinians, including outlawing communities, demolishing their houses, revoking their residences, imposing restrictions on the registration of newborns. But it doesn't just stop there. There is the coercive environment to drive out Palestinians by denying them very basic services, including electricity, water, roads, education, and healthcare. So, with all of this bleak picture that we have here, I don't want to just end on that. So I will end in the last part of my speech here on what is it that we can do together, not just to salvage, not just to protect Palestine and Israeli exceptionalism, which has gotten us to where we have gotten to today, but also to salvage humanity and to have the opportunity to choose humanity over narrow racist identity politics, basically here. And I name here two main categories of what is it that we can do, or three main categories of what is it that we can do. You will see pictures here that show the grassroots mass mobilization, from demonstrations to encampments. Some people might ask, are they effective? Of course they are. Your country's policies would have been much worse if there wasn't these encampments and these demonstrations. These encampments are also proving to be very vital in institutions declaring their investments and providing a platform to push more and more forward for divestment, which is the second thing that I will be talking about. We can individually boycott companies that are complicit in military occupation, apartheid, and genocide. These resources are more readily available through apps that are available on iOS, on Android, and different kinds of phones here. I recommend the use of No Thanks. That's the application I use, but I know that there are plenty others that are very accessible to know which companies are actually complicit in genocide and apartheid here. More institutionally, because we are here in an academic institution, Western universities have rushed to increase the funding and the schemes available for Palestinian students, given the destruction of higher education in Gaza. That's important, but it only deals with the symptoms here. What we need to go further and do is to instill proper institutional partnerships between Palestinian universities and universities in Ireland, in the UK, in the wider Western world here. This is very important to instill joint collaboration between these two. Additionally, it's important to note that there's increasing research that demonstrates the complicity of Israeli institutions, Israeli universities, in military occupation, genocide, and apartheid. I invite you to read Towers of Ivory and Steel by the wonderful Maya Wind here. This is a key aspect for us to move forward with the academic boycott of Israeli institutions until they adhere or they stop supporting apartheid and genocide. And lastly, I go back to the grassroots and I say it's very important to keep applying pressure on governments, because it is only this that will lead to accountability, to ending Israel's impunity, and for once and for all, say no Israeli exceptionalism never again applies to all of us. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. Maybe. That's okay. Is that
good? Okay. Hey. All right, so on behalf of me and my incredibly bright and rigorous co-author, Luc, she can't be here today because she's completing and soon defending her master's thesis at the Université Catholique de Louvain. Thank you to the organizers for all the work you've put into making this conference a reality and for the invitation to share our works in progress paper with you today. So to begin, I want to note that I live in Ottawa, so-called Ottawa, the capital of Canada, which is located on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. And in stating this, I'll note that it isn't an accident, but rather a structural necessity for the Canadian state, situated on stolen Indigenous land, to continue to support genocidal land theft in Palestine by the Israeli state, which was founded in 1948. To not do so would put into question the legitimacy of Canada, along with its institutions, laws, policies, and practices that have sustained and further entrenched the Canadian settler colonial nation building project before and after our confederation in 1867. And certainly from where we're situated today in the north of Ireland, we can also make sense of why the UK remains a steadfast supporter of Israel, even amid the deaths of tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza that have been indiscriminately murdered by the IDF in the name of self-defense. So no matter where those of us gathered here today are from, it's certainly an important moment for us to collectively reflect upon human rights harms and our responsibilities as scholars in these horrific times. And I hope this paper meets the moment. It probably won't, but here we go. So, in the wake of the 7 October 2023 attacks by Hamas on targets situated on Palestinian lands claimed by Israeli settlers, Israel has waged its latest military campaign in Gaza, which has killed more than 37,000 people and displaced over 1.7 million people, according to recent estimates, according to Tamara, Tamimi, who just shared her research with us all. I'm grateful for your work. Entire households, neighborhoods, and even universities like the one we're in now have been wiped off the map. So if we're in Palestine right now, we're not here. The International Court of Justice has described the situation as, I quote, a plausible genocide, while the International Criminal Court has applied for warrants of arrest for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel Minister of Defense Gallant for, and I quote, war crimes and crimes against humanity committed on the territory of the state of Palestine. Prior to this, the unfolding genocidal violence occurring in Palestine prompted and continues to prompt massive demonstrations across the world calling for a ceasefire and the liberation of Palestine. In turn, many of these protests have been subject to criminalization and other forms of illegalization. So engaging with works by Thomas Matisse in this paper, the longer version of it anyways, examines the use of noise ordinance bylaws to illegalize and issue costly fines against demonstrators who use megaphones and other means to amplify their dissent and resistance to the continued bombardment, occupation, and apartheid in Palestine during protests in Ottawa, where I'm from. In conversation with scholarly debates on the role of activists in public criminology, the paper also explores the possibilities and limits of extra academic engagement through an analysis of a campaign and zine calling for the abolition of noise ordinance bylaws involving the Criminalization and Punishment Education Project, an activist research group that I helped co-found in 2012. In interrogating the process involved in and narratives produced through the campaign and zine project, the paper upon which this presentation is based highlights the amplified words subject to bylaw fines, the impact these sanctions had on Megaphone users and within the activist community, as well as what targeted demonstrators would like to see happen in both Ottawa in response to the attempted sonic silencing of political dissent, and in Palestine where genocidal violence continues. And in doing so, the paper highlights the need for abolitionist criminological interventions that entail collective struggle and advocacy with the oppressed and antagonism rather than complicity with the carceral state. Okay, so this is a lit review. Luc put together a 5,000 word lit review. I'm doing 500 words, so apologies for the brevity. So let's trace the beginnings of the social, cultural, and political uses of the megaphone and sound amplification, both historically and in contemporary times. So through the amplification of the sound level of speaking voices, the megaphone allows for the dissemination of sounds and communication of discourse across an extended space, reaching distant individuals. According to its historiography, based primarily on the works of François Baskovich, this instrument originated from numerous scientific developments in the fields of acoustics. The author explains that the invention of the speaking trumpet, an ancestor of the megaphone, derived from specific needs of the time, appearing in 1670. It was primarily designed to enable communication at sea. Other devices were also developed, such as acoustic horns, tubes, and pipes that propagate sound, and architectural techniques allowing for discrete conversations. As noted by Brett Edwards, by the 19th century and the Victorian era, the original non-electric, or electronic, I should say, megaphone played, and I quote, a prominent role in the patriarchal power structure and leisure culture of the Victorian era. Specifically, while the Victorian cultural context was marked by the veneration of industrialization, progress, and the development of the market economy, men used the megaphone in the 19th century and early 20th centuries to, and I quote, entertain, educate, and profit from an audience primarily composed of middle and upper class members eager to engage in activities considered appropriate to their social status, like horse racing, and in doing so, perpetuate their own privileged position within Victorian society. Minority groups occasionally made use of the megaphone in this patriarchal Victorian context, such as suffragettes that organized and took to the streets of New York City in 1904, distributing votes for women badges from a taxi from which they proclaimed slogans in favor of women's suffrage using a non-electronic megaphone. However, it's only after World War II that the megaphone, now a transistorized, inexpensive, and highly mobile electronic acoustic device, largely effective, addressing large crowds, numbering hundreds and even thousands of people, became increasingly synonymous with liberation struggles during the civil rights era, allowing, and I quote, a traditional marginalized voice to be amplified and no less importantly recognized and respected. Facilitated by the megaphone, these protests throughout the 20th century had broader and deeper repercussions related to notions of gender and social race and the identities of megaphone users, allowing more marginalized groups to appropriate public space, as well as formulate and disseminate their demands in an unjust and an unequal society in need of equity and the redistribution of power. It's also important to note that at the threshold of the 21st century, sound became increasingly deployed as acoustic repression by armed military and police forces, which is discussed at length in Juliette Volkler's 2011 book, Sound as Weapon. For instance, in September 2005, in the skies of Gaza, Israel Army planes deliberately broke the sound barrier at low altitude to emit sensory controls on the Palestinian population. During a 4-day nocturnal period following these abusive interventions, 29 supersonic detonations were recorded, causing severe damage due to sound saturation with, and I quote, windows breaking by the thousands, walls cracking. The victims of these bangs suffering, among other things, anxiety attacks, muscle spasms, difficulty breathing. Fuck that. Regarding public spaces, Volkler explores how authorities have used sound amplification to disperse, harass, and immobilize crowds, including through the use of disencirclement and multisensory grenades in France as being one example in response to these kinds of protests. So, if we understand sound is a weapon, if we understand that it's an expression of power dynamics, we must also recognize that it is a site of struggle as part of broader competing movements to entrench versus upend the status quo, including with respect to Palestine. And in this context, we've certainly seen contestation around the use of sound, namely in the form of speech that criticizes and demands alternatives to occupation, apartheid, and genocide in Palestine. And in these contests, one can document what Thomas Matthiessen has called silent silencing, that's meant to bring, and I quote, acquiescence through a process which is quiet rather than noisy, hidden rather than open, unnoticed rather than noticeable, unseen rather than seen, non-physical rather than physical. Like I'm sure the pressure many of you in this room felt from the media or our own academic institutions to not denounce Israel's military response to the attacks on October 7th. However, for the purpose of this paper, which documents the deployment of fines by policing authorities in Ottawa to silence and attempt what in the politics of abolition Mathieson calls defining in and defining out who and what can be heard in given struggles, what we're talking about when examining who can use megaphones and other means of amplification in recent months generally, and Palestinian solidarity protests specifically, are, and I quote, ways of silencing that are at once loud and noisy and meant to sonically silence dissent, which I'll define here clumsily as trying to disperse, disappear, and delete revolutionary analyses and demands from public space. So let's get to that. So the current iteration of the noise bylaw for the City of Ottawa has been in place since 2017 with the explicit aim, and I quote, to reduce the noise level so as to preserve, protect, and promote health, safety, welfare, peace, and quiet of the inhabitants of the city, all said to be in the public interest. The noise bylaw includes several sections, including on, and I quote, sound reproduction or amplification devices, which notes, no person shall operate or use or cause to be operated or used any sound reproduction device on any highway or other public space, unless as specified in a list of exemptions, including applying for a permit for demonstrations. We need permission to fucking say something. Anyways, interestingly, until Ottawa resident Zexi Lee and her lawyer Paul Champ filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit and secured a court injunction against Freedom Convoy organizers. You may have heard about the Freedom Convoy. If you haven't, look it up. The City of Ottawa didn't take decisive action to end the cacophony of truck horns being regularly sounded off for days on end during the beginning of this early 2022 fascist occupation of Parliament Hill and Centertown neighborhoods where it's located. Like, there were literally fucking trucks sounding horns at all hours of the fucking day for fucking weeks before they put these noise bylaws into action. But when weekly Palestine solidarity protests that began in October 2023, both in Ottawa and across the world, were growing in size and continued into November and December as Israel's so-called war against Hamas decimated lives and infrastructure in Gaza, bylaw officers and Ottawa Police Service members issued 48 fines totaling $23,000, beginning with speakers using megaphones and microphones involved in Palestine solidarity demonstrations. That's at first. And then they extended it to participants of trans health defense rallies, work strikes, and climate protests that in previous times were not fined for using amplification devices. So if you ever wondered which side the fucking cops are on, wonder no more. So beyond the financial impacts of the fines themselves, which were on average $480 each, there are also impacts of the process in which they were meted out. So here's a quote by Hakimi Morkardi, an Ottawa resident ticketed for using a megaphone at a Palestine solidarity protest, that illustrates some of the personal anguish associated with how fines were delivered. So the officer came at about 5:30 to give me a ticket for using a megaphone. My 12-year-old daughter saw him and came to tell me that a police officer was at a doorstep. She was scared and asked me, "Are they going to take you to jail?" So in response to the ratcheting up of criminalization and illegalization of amplified speech at Palestine Solidarity and other social justice events in Ottawa, organizers from 50 groups came together to start the Defend the Right to Dissent campaign, which has two key demands. First, the groups are seeking an amendment to the bylaw that I just mentioned earlier to exempt protests and pickets from megaphone and other sound amplification noise fines. Second, the groups are demanding that the fines be waived immediately in a manner consistent with constitutional rights, namely freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. So in support of these demands in the campaign, participating groups have organized a ZAP campaign that's been endorsed by thousands of Ottawa residents to date, as well as staged a press conference, a well-attended rally, and organized delegations at City of Ottawa committee hearings. So the Criminalization and Punishment Education Project has taken part in this organizing. CPEP for short is a group of criminology, sociology, and socio-legal students and professors from Carleton University and the University of Ottawa that organizes with criminalized people and their loved ones and other community members to reduce the use and harms of policing and imprisonment while working towards decarceral futures. So we at CPEP, we aren't engaged in what Vincenzo Ruggiero calls mainstream criminology. That's not what we fucking do. that encompasses research and public interventions undertaken as part of, and I quote, a conflict against the powerless for the perpetuation of the status quo and the exacerbation of social injustice. Rather, we're engaged in what Victoria Canning and colleagues call activist criminology that involves, and I quote, work with counter-hegemonic groups of all shapes and sizes to enable communities to build bonds of solidarity and safety that facilitate their survival during increasingly perilous times. So since the founding of CPEP in 2012, we've engaged in activist criminology in various ways, including action research, documenting and countering state discourses related to a $1 billion jail that the government of Ontario wanted to build, which we stopped. Organizing in concert with other groups in the city through our No Ottawa Prison Expansion campaign. Back to this. As it concerns the Defend the Right to Dissent campaign, we're in the process of researching the history and uses of the megaphone and sound amplification, including in the context of social movements and state repression, along with the origins and subsequent shifts and continuities in noise ordinances as a means of situating the present struggle around illegalization of Palestine solidarity protests in Ottawa and elsewhere, and trying to inform some resistance to sonic silencing. And through this work, which is fundamentally about the liberation of Palestinians and our own in terms of defending our free speech and assembly rights, we collaborated with key campaign organizers and those who've been targeted by fines to come up with this zine. It's just a zine, okay? But it's a zine. The first in a series stemming from this research, which was put together to drive traffic to the emails app. That's what we were trying to do with this thing. It's not a big goal. And help generate turnout for the rally that took place last night. And it was a small contribution. Not gonna amplify or make it seem like it was something bigger than that. And unfortunately, death making in Palestine, whether we're talking about the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, or other necropolitical structures, that continues without regard for the people that are injured, maimed, and killed by them. So too do the fines. The fines are continuing as well. We're fighting, and we have to continue to fight, but that's still going on. These are dark and troubling times. So to conclude, what ought to be the role of scholars in criminology and adjacent disciplines right now? Tamara had many important ideas. Shall we practice criminologies of liberation or oppression? Should we practice criminologies that work with or against the oppressed? Should we practice criminologies committed to organizing and building the people power necessary to win the better world that's possible? A better world is possible. Or commit ourselves to insular criminologies from the imagined safe purchase of our offices and seminar room lecterns? One thing I'll say, speaking of the safe space of academia, it isn't fucking safe. You all know that. For some more than others. I mean, I'm a white dude, so it's pretty safe for me. But for others, it's not. So if what's transpiring at my university, where the liberal facade is showing itself to be intolerant to dissent on the question of Palestine once again, and where the idea of the university as a refuge is being shattered, it's being shattered as fascists inside and outside the ivory tower attempt to silence those denouncing occupation, apartheid, and genocide. I don't think we as critical criminologists, if that's what we are, and scholars have the choice but to engage in collective struggle and advocacy with the oppressed and antagonism vis-a-vis the carceral state. Our ideas and our ability to share them are under attack. They're always under attack. So, as you'll hear from my brave colleague, Lydia Dobson, who co-runs the prison law practicum at the University of Ottawa and is presenting her paper co-authored with Alexandria Bonney entitled Palestine Prison Abolition and Pedagogy, Reflections on Silencing in the Academy, and that's happening during the critical activist criminology session this afternoon. You may be denounced in a national newspaper or face an internal investigation because a single student complains that an Amnesty International video describing Gaza as an open-air prison is out of bounds in a prison law seminar about settler colonialism. Okay? In response to the organization of an encampment, you see a picture here, demanding that the University of Ottawa disclose its investments in the military-industrial complex and divest from war profiteering, vis-a-vis the ongoing genocide in Palestine, the administration has threatened, and I quote, serious consequences for those involved in staging this peaceful action. And if you go there, I mean, like, it's pretty serene, other than like the carnage that everyone's discussing there. Like, I don't know what the fuck they're bringing serious consequences to. It's through student organizing and solidarity from professors and others that the encampment remains open while negotiations with the administration to disclose and divest continue. In another troubling episode, one of my colleagues, I won't name them, who co-authored a paper documenting law-breaking by Israeli charities involved in expanding settlements in Palestine, faced a complaint that led to an investigation by the journal that published their article to determine whether it should be retracted because they claimed that the piece was anti-Semitic. Fortunately, my colleague's co-author is Jewish, and that fact, coupled with their debunking of the frivolous claims made against them, ensured their peer-reviewed article wasn't retracted. But there was a fucking investigation that went on for a couple weeks, and it was pretty stressful for my colleague. I raise these examples now to highlight that the classroom, the university, and the academy aren't spaces of refuge. No, these spaces, like the streets where Ottawa bylaw and police are busy issuing fines to Palestine solidarity protesters engaged in amplified dissent, these are all sites of struggle. This is a site of struggle. And it's our responsibility to organize and resist the creeping in of fascism and institutional complicity and genocide at work on our campuses. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Justin. Next up, we have Alice Panepinto, who's a reader here at Queen's University. She will be speaking about settler violence as state violence, agency, and responsibility for ideologically driven crime in the West Bank. Come on. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the organisers for having me today. I'll be talking a little bit about topics that complement what Tamara and Justin have already eloquently and comprehensively spoken about, which I suppose fits the wider conversation that we're all having and that we all need to be having more of in relation to Palestine. I will focus on settler violence, which is a phenomenon that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, also because it's been in the press over the past 6 months, most notably in relation to the US decision to issue individual sanctions against, I think, all of 13 violent settlers. I will give a little bit of an overview of, let's see if this works, of what I'll talk about. I'll frame the legal political geography of Palestine, focusing on the West Bank, and I'll go back in time because despite the urgency of here and now, the injustice in Palestine is something that goes back well over 100 years, and I think that framing is quite important. Then we'll look at settler violence in a bit more detail, and then I'll do what international lawyers do, which is try and attribute these unlawful acts to the state, because unfortunately in my discipline there's a state centrism that makes it very difficult at times to actually get things done in a way which is satisfactory, in ways in which law and justice are not antagonistic. Right, so the problem. Over the past 10 years, we've seen a rise in settler violence. This is amply documented by, obviously, Palestinian human rights observers and victims, international organisations, including the various UN monitoring bodies operating in Palestine, and many more. However, since October last year, while all eyes have been on the unfolding genocide in Gaza, there has been a spike in settler violence. And this, in many ways, has accelerated a process which has been gaining momentum for much longer than we realise. So, individual sanctions have been imposed on a handful of settlers by a handful of Western states, including 3 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And this really irked me. And I was like, there's something that we need to better understand and better frame, right? These are not just a few bad apples. These are not a handful of common criminals going from their settler outposts to Palestinian villages, committing an obscene amount of mindless violence. These are actually individuals that are operating in an enabling context, and that enabling context is the Israeli state. And what these acts of violence do is complex and multifaceted, but in effect, settler violence furthers the state's aim to consolidate Israeli takeover of Palestinian land, which is, the raison d'etre of the Israeli state, in as much as it inherited the Zionist project in, the pre-state era. So, by ensuring impunity for ideologically driven violent settlers, arming them, and even allowing members of the armed forces and the police to attack Palestinians alongside settlers, the state is doing much more in terms of its participation in settler violence than, Biden, Sunak, and Macron have dared to look at. And this is why I think this work is important. Right. So, I won't talk to you about theories and methods. That's mostly due to my disciplinary limitations. But I can answer questions later on if you are interested. Let's look at the legal and political geography that we're talking about. Right. So, I've taken some quotes here from the most recent UN human rights bodies report on settlements, which is, I think, from March 2023. It's about a year and a bit old now. So the settler presence and violence, which appears designed to terrorise, note use of that word. This is the UN, it's not Alice. Terrorise Palestinians as part of a calculated and systematic effort to expand Israeli control beyond the settlement jurisdiction areas. Right? So we're talking about the legal political geography. I'll show you some maps in just a minute. This will give you a sense of what settler violence is doing on behalf of the state. It expands control, it expands Israeli control over territory. So wherever there's a settlement, there's always an effort to expand the area of Palestinian land, which is occupied under international law, but of course it is slated by Israel for appropriation, right? Which is, of course, unlawful. So I want to draw your attention to 2 quotes. One is taken from a constitutional law of the State of Israel of 2018, which enshrines Jewish settlement as a national value, right? And encourages and advances the project of Jewish settlement. And the other quote is a quote from the 1920s by Jabotinsky, who's one of the fathers of the ideology of the Israeli right. And it's interesting because he talks about Zionist colonization of Palestine at that time, right? In 1923, I'll talk to you about it more if you want later. Palestine was in an international arrangement called the British Mandate, which essentially was a colonial trick for Britain to exercise its control over that part of the world. And under the aegis of British colonialism, it was under the aegis of British colonialism at that time that the Zionist project, the European project, came into fruition. And that was through the support, material and political, offered by the League of Nations, right, which is the precursor of the UN. Anyway, going back to the two quotes, you see how settlements, Jewish settlements and Zionist colonization is something that has a flip side. And that flip side is the native population, right? The native population of Palestine are, of course, the Palestinian Arabs, right? So we see a tension there within the political and legal geography of Palestine of these past 100 or so years. And there's a continuum, right? There's a continuum between the Zionist intellectuals of the 1920s and the current manifestations of the state of Israel, right? So it's regardless of the native population. And we see this in the West Bank as well as in Gaza. So very briefly, many of you will be familiar with this map and many others. This is what has happened to Palestine over the past 100 years. If you see the final map here to the right, the areas in yellow are what is essentially left, although we can't entirely say that these are areas controlled by Palestinians for a number of reasons. I want to fast forward to 1995 and the Oslo peace agreements, right? The Oslo peace agreements did a number of things. But one thing that they did in terms of the legal and political geography of Palestine is set out this new denomination of areas A, B, and C. Area C, which is approximately maybe 2/3 of the entirety of the West Bank, is controlled both militarily and civilly by Israel. And it's an Area C, which is where the Israeli settlements are. The Israeli settlements, we'll talk to you about them in just a moment. Cannot stress this enough. It is consolidated international law and international politics that they are illegal under international law. But it is Area C of the West Bank which is being used and developed entirely for the benefit of Israel's civilian population. So the land in Area C is particularly at risk of being taken over. And settler violence, as we shall see, is one of the tools that the state has adopted to do so, to conquer more land than it is able to do by using its boots on the ground in a conventional sense. Also because the conquest of territory through force or the threat of force violates Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which is a pretty big deal. So, this map gives you a little overview of settler violence across the West Bank in relation to where the main settlements are. We have approximately 700,000 settlers living unlawfully in illegal settlements in the West Bank. There are close to 280 settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and roughly 150 are called outposts. And these are illegal also, according to Israeli law. However, it's these outposts which are at the heart of the settlement project, which has now been reinvigorated through the Basic Law of 2018. As I've said, all of these are illegal under international law. It's not moot. This is consolidated. Right. And it's established because of, the Fourth Geneva Convention's clarity on the matter. The occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. And it also has confirmation politically, notably in a UN Security Council resolution not vetoed by the US in Obama's last month, and which reaffirms the illegality of settlements in the territory occupied since 1967. We don't have time to go into territory occupied before 1967, but there's a conversation to be had in that context as well. Let's move on to settler violence. Settler violence against Palestinians serves as a method to take over land. This is the UN. It's not Alice. This is the UN. Let's have a quick look at the empirical findings, right? So as I said previously, most settler violence occurs in the vicinity of outposts. These are illegal under international law, as all settlements are, but they are also, for the most part, illegal under Israeli law, despite the fact that key members of the current governing coalition are advocating quite successfully in many respects for their legalization. Right? So outposts and thus the realization of the 2018 constitutional law, which enshrines the value of perpetual settlement. Outposts and perpetual settlements are very often the heart of settler violence, right? We also know that Israeli security forces play a significant role in protecting outposts, and they don't routinely stop settler violence. In fact, we have a number of accounts, including from a fantastic Israeli human rights NGO called B'Tselem, articulating countless incidents in which uniformed personnel participate in settler violence alongside settlers, despite the fact that their primary obligation should be to protect the civilian Palestinian population of occupied territory. Let's look at the typologies of settler violence. So having reviewed the live databases of settler violence maintained by UN, OCHA and B'Tselem, we can group these incidents in many different ways. I've done so for the purposes of today, kind of in a classic way. So we have a number of offences against the person, and particularly a number of offences against property. So just to give you a sense of scale, since October last year, we have approximately 950 reported attacks by settlers against Palestinian civilians and Palestinian property. We have confirmation that at least 10 Palestinians have been killed by settlers during acts of settler violence, and approximately 230 Palestinians have been injured in attacks by settlers. We have over 750 incidents of property damaged as part of settler violence as well. And something which really struck me was the use and misuse of pastoralism. So one way for settlers to take over Palestinian land is to remove, either by killing or stealing, Palestinian flocks and replacing them with settler flocks. So this is a way of squatting and land takeover which is quite unique to that context. We also have a number of other offences that I have put in a miscellaneous category here. We have access restrictions that have an impact not only on freedom of movement, but also on education, health, right to work, etc. But also, and this is quite important, attacks on the economic sustainability of these Palestinian communities targeted by settler violence. These are usually agro-pastoralist communities. They depend on the land. So they're small farmers, they're, small shepherds. So to lose their flocks, to lose their land, to have their olives uprooted at the time of harvest, basically condemns them to dire poverty, right? Making them dependent on foreign aid and charity, as opposed to, being able to sustain themselves like anyone else. Right. So let's look at the attribution to the state. Again, I cite from the UN report I mentioned earlier. Violence by settlers and the Israeli superiority forces has become increasingly interwoven. So there's that aspect, but there's also another aspect, which is about the state responsibility even after attacks occur, right? So incidents of settler violence, we know, represent a violation of a range of international legal provisions. So the state has a responsibility to protect Palestinian civilians. The state is the occupying power under international law. I won't go into details, but this is, again, IHL 101. So the state responsibilities are an arc, ex ante, during attacks, ex post, right? So, the state must make sure that these Palestinian communities receive adequate protection, but it doesn't. The state must ensure that its forces do not participate in attacks, but it doesn't. And ex post, the state must ensure that that anyone responsible for settler violence is investigated and tried appropriately. However, we have some really, really troubling reports from Israeli human rights NGO Yesh Din indicating that less than 1% of settler attacks actually reaches the sentencing stage, which gives us a sense of a climate of impunity, which raises the question of, is the state complicit? Is the state willing to look the other way because settler violence is playing the long game for the state, which is consolidating Israel's grip over as much Palestinian land as possible? So, state responsibility for internationally wrongful acts. There's a whole field of international law on this that I won't bore you with. But, what are these internationally wrongful acts? They can be acts or omissions. They must breach an international obligation and must be governed by international law. And in order for them to be attributed to the state, even if it is not state forces involved, so even in cases where army members are not actively participating alongside settlers in torching Palestinian homes, there's a whole area of international law that attributes such acts to the state. So obviously organs of the state and conduct of persons exercising governmental authority. There's more. There's an excessive authority or contravention of instructions, conduct directed or controlled by the state, or carried out in absence of official authorities. There's also a question around insurrectional or other movements. Are ideologically driven extremist settlers in the West Bank one of these movements? Are they a non-state armed group which, over time, have entered the fold of the gentrified Israeli right-wing politics? Well, there's an argument to make there. And there's, of course, conduct acknowledged and adopted by a state as its own, and there's a lot of international law jurisprudence on this topic. So examples from the field could include when off-duty members of state forces attack Palestinians with state-issued weapons, or when settlers take their version of the law into their own hands and decide that no, there should be no Palestinians there for whatever reason. So instead of summoning law enforcement agents, they take matters into their own hands and decide to torch Palestinian homes to remove Palestinians. And as I said earlier, extremist settlers once were on the margins of Israeli society and Israeli politics. Now they are their representatives, including 2 government ministers, are not only part of the governing coalition, but they prop up Netanyahu's government. So they are at the heart of Israeli politics. And this is significant, So settlers who engage in acts of violence actually have representatives in government who are ideologically aligned, right? So this is quite interesting, but also very worrying. And what about government ministers' public expressions of approval after settler violence occurs, right? Is this a way to ascribe settler violence to the state? Perhaps. So my concluding thoughts. Settler violence which is committed by individuals or groups of individual citizens must be contextualised within an ongoing occupation with annexationist features, right? I cited the 2018 Basic Law, enshrining the value of perpetual settlement, which is kind of a continuum with the Zionist project of the early 20th century. State law supports settlement expansion. There's no other way of putting this. So whenever outposts take over more land through the acts of violent settlers, they're not doing anything which contradicts that basic law of 2018. And the endorsement of settler violence and its ideology by ministers gives us a sense that these aren't just a few bad apples who are going out and torching Palestinian homes and driving them from their communities. This is part of the mainstream Israeli political context right now. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I look forward to them.